Since their introduction in World War I, tanks have continuously improved and refined to this day, providing necessary firepower, mobility, and protection on the battlefield. However, the very design that makes them a feared opponent can be extremely dangerous for their crews. Today, we are going to talk about some tank models that were notoriously known for their reputation for catching fire, exploding, or being difficult to escape in emergencies. Let's start with one of the most famous tanks of all time, the legendary Sherman. While it had a reputation as an easy-to-knock-out tank, later improvements made it one of the safest tanks for its crew, allowing them to evacuate safely upon being hit most of the time. It approximately had one crew member killed per destroyed tank, which was a good statistic compared to other tanks of the time. However, in early versions, this wasn't the case, and some flaws earned the Sherman tank morbid nicknames by the enemy, such as Tommy Cookers or Ronson Lighter, which was advertised with the slogan, "Lights every time." The first critical flaw of early Shermans, besides running on highly flammable gasoline, was that they didn't have any protection for their ammunition, meaning that shells were stored in racks without any additional armor. When tanks were hit, the ammunition would easily catch fire and quickly cause internal explosions, completely destroying the tank and everyone inside. In combination with early small hatches for the driver and co-driver, and the loader not having any hatch, this proved catastrophic for its crews, earning a spot on the list as a death trap. The hatches for the driver and co-driver were fairly narrow and initially didn't have springs for easier opening, so the tankers had to fight the full weight of the hatch and then push themselves through it and out in their bulky tank suits while the tank was likely already burning. As for the loader, the situation was terrifying. The first Shermans didn't have a hatch for the loader, and his only way of getting out was under or over the cannon, depending on which position the gun was when hit, and then through the commander's hatch. This required time, and if the gunner or commander were knocked out in their positions, he couldn't exit through their hatches. This was later solved by adding an additional hatch for the loader, significantly easing his life, as well as the wet stowage system, where ammunition is stored in compartments surrounded by a liquid-filled jacket, typically a mixture of water and ethylene glycol, similar to antifreeze. The liquid acted as a fire suppressant and as a layer of protection which drastically improved crew survivability. Also, additional armor plates were welded around ammo racks from the outside. Next is the less famous Type 97 Chiha, a medium tank used by the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II. Despite its significant role in the Pacific Theater, and arguably being the best Japanese tank of the war, when faced with Allied tanks, it was drastically outgunned in every segment. The Chiha was plagued with numerous design flaws that made it especially dangerous for its crews. Thin armor, flammable components, and inadequate escape options turned the Chiha into a veritable death trap in combat situations. Its armor was only 25 millimeters thick at its strongest point. This made it highly susceptible to penetration by even light anti-tank weapons, and even small arms rounds could find their way through and ricochet inside the tank, creating horror for the crew. In combination with poorly protected fuel tanks and ammunition compartments with small and awkwardly positioned hatches, the Chiha was truly a death trap for its crew if hit. There were no hatches in the bow of the tank for the driver or co-driver. They had to pass their seats and various racks to exit, often resulting in the crew being trapped inside the burning tank. Besides that, it had riveted armor, which proved catastrophic if hit even by non-penetrating rounds, because the bolts could break off and become bullets inside the tank. Another famous example is the legendary Soviet T-34 tank. It was the most produced and the most destroyed tank of the war, with around 80% loss rate. Although it was one of the icons of World War II and helped win the war, the T-34 was far from a safe place to be in and not easy to escape from in a hurry when your life depended on it. Let's start with its armor, which was sloped to maximize protection against projectiles. but this made the interior of the tank cramped and hard to maneuver in. The armor was also prone to splintering, and even non-penetrating hits could cause spalling, sending deadly metal pieces flying into the tankers' faces. There was never an attempt to store ammunition safely, and Soviet high-explosive tank shells caught fire more easily than Western types, meaning that an explosion was almost certain just moments after a fire broke out. Ammunition was stored all around the tank and close to the fuel tanks, which was far from safe. The sloped frontal armor and the driver's heavy frontal hatch in an awkward position made it terribly difficult to open and exit even in normal conditions, let alone when there was smoke coming. The preferred option was to exit through the turret if it was passable and there was time. For the turret crew, it wasn't much better, as there wasn't much space, and the hatches were small, narrow, and also awkwardly placed. The sight of burning T-34s became a grimly familiar one on the Eastern Front, and they had double the crew death ratio per destroyed tank compared to American tankers, despite having one crew member less. The T-34-85 variant featured a larger turret with a more spacious interior, slightly improving crew conditions. However, many of the fundamental design flaws, such as the vulnerable ammunition storage and challenging escape routes, remained. Another famous example from Russia, but in more modern times, shows how even modern tanks can have some old flaws and be extremely dangerous to their crews, turning them into death traps. The T-72 and T-90 tanks are two of the most famous examples of modern Russian armor. Developed during the Cold War and post-Soviet era, these tanks were designed to provide superior firepower, mobility, and protection, and for some time, they did. But they had one big flaw that proved catastrophic in the case of armor penetration: their autoloader and ammunition storage. Both the T-72 and T-90 tanks, and many other variants based on this design, use an autoloader mechanism to feed shells into the main gun. This system allows the tank to fire more rapidly and reduces the crew size by eliminating the need for a human loader. The autoloader stores the ammunition in a carousel located at the base of the turret, right beneath the crew members. The carousel design means that ammunition is stored in a circular arrangement, ready to be automatically loaded into the gun. This setup maximizes the rate of fire and keeps the crew focused on other tasks, enhancing the tank's combat efficiency. However, this compact storage method comes with significant risks. When the tank is hit by an enemy round, especially from the side or top, the armor can be penetrated and the stored ammunition can be struck. If this happens, the ammunition often detonates violently. The resulting explosion generates immense pressure, often blowing the turret clean off the tank's hull. This jack-in-the-box effect not only destroys the tank, but also leaves little chance for the crew to survive. As for the driver, his exit route is complicated by the cannon being directly on top of his hatch, and if hit in a bad position, it could block his hatch. Then he must go through the turret if possible and if there's enough time. However, the T-72 and T-90 continue to serve in many armies worldwide, and their crews are constantly aware of these inherent dangers. One interesting example, though not technically a tank, is the Italian Tanket from the Second World War. While Tankets were intended for reconnaissance and infantry support in the absence of main battle tanks, these small, lightly armored vehicles, called cockroaches, were used extensively by Italian forces. The armor was exceptionally thin, offering little protection against even light arms fire, let alone anti-tank weapons. The crew of two had to squeeze in through one narrow hatch, making the conditions inside far from ideal. Today, in some modern tanks, ammunition is stored in special armored compartments that, if they explode, direct the blast away from the crew. Fire-resistant suits and automatic fire-extinguishing systems are now standard. Tanks also have better escape hatches, and crews regularly practice escape drills, making it easier and faster to get out in an emergency. To prevent spalling, advanced armor is used that absorbs and deflects incoming shots, reducing the risk of deadly metal fragments inside. These improvements greatly increase the chances of survival for the tank crews. However, modern tanks also face new and much more dangerous threats.